Round the Fire by Mrs. Crowe. I have travelled a great deal, said our next speaker, the Chevalier, and certainly I have never been in any country where instances of these spiritual appearances were not adduced on apparently credible authority. I have heard numerous stories of the sort, but the one that most readily occurs to me at present was told to me not long ago in Paris by a count, whose name occurs in the history of the remarkable incidents connected with the death of Emperor Paul. The Count, my authority for the following story, was attached to the Russian embassy, and he told me one evening, when the conversation turned on the inconveniences of travelling in the east of Europe, that on one occasion, when in Poland, he found himself about 7 o'clock in an autumn evening on a forest road, where there was no possibility of finding a house of public entertainment within many miles. There was a frightful storm. The road was not good at the best of times, and was now almost impracticable from the weather, and his horses were completely knocked up. On consulting his people what was best to be done, they said that to go back was about as impossible as to go forward, but that by turning around a little off the main road, they should soon reach a castle, where possibly shelter might be procured for the night. The Count gladly consented, and it was not long before they found themselves at the gate of what appeared a building on a very splendid scale. The courier quickly alighted and rang the bell. It was some time before the bell was answered, but at length an elderly man appeared at a wicket with a lantern and peeped out. On perceiving the equipage, he came forward and stepped up to the carriage, holding the light aloft to discover who was inside. The Count handed him his card and explained his distress. "There is no one here, my lord," replied the man, "but myself and my family. The castle is not inhabited." "That's bad news," said the Count, "but nevertheless you can give me what I am in most need of, and that is shelter for the night." "Willingly," said the man, "if your lordship will put up with such accommodation as we can hastily prepare." "So," said the Count. I alighted and walked in, and the old man unbarred the great gates to admit my carriages and people. As we had provender for the cattle, we wanted for nothing but beds and a good fire, and, as the only one lighted was in the old man's apartments, he first took us there. They consisted of a suite of small rooms in the left wing that had probably been formerly occupied by the upper servants. They were comfortably furnished, and he and his large family appeared to be very well lodged. Besides the wife, there were 3 sons with their wives and children, and 2 nieces, and in a part of the offices where I saw a light, I was told there were labourers and women servants, for it was a valuable estate with a fine forest, and the sons acted as gardes chassés. "Is there much game in the forest?" I asked. "A great deal, of all sorts," they answered. "Well, then I suppose during the season the family lives here?" "Never," they replied. "None of the family ever reside here." "Indeed?" I said. "Well, how is that? It seems a very fine place." "Superb," answered the wife of the custodian, "but the castle is haunted." She said this with a simple gravity that made me laugh, upon which they all stared at me with the most edifying amazement. "Well, I beg your pardon," I said, "but you know, perhaps in great cities, such as I usually inhabit, there are no ghosts." Indeed, said they, no ghosts. Well, at least, I said, I had never heard of any. We don't believe in such things. They looked at each other with surprise, but said nothing, not appearing to have any desire to convince me. But do you mean to say, said I, that the reason for the family not living here, and the castle being abandoned, is on that very account? It is haunted? Yes, they replied, that is the reason nobody has resided here for many years. Well, how can you live here, then? We are never troubled in this part of the building, said she. We hear noises, but we are used to that. Well, if there is a ghost, said I hope I shall see it. God forbid, said the woman, crossing herself. We shall guard against that. Your signore will sleep not far from this, where you will be quite safe. Oh, I said, I am quite serious. If there is a ghost, I should particularly like to see him, and I should be much obliged if you would put me in the apartments he most frequents. They opposed this proposition earnestly, and begged me not even to think of it. Besides, they said, if anything was to happen to my lord, how should they answer for it? But as I insisted, the women went to call the members of the family who were lighting fires and preparing beds in some rooms on the same floor as they occupied themselves. When they came, they were as earnest against the indulgence of my wishes as the women had been. Still, I insisted. Are you afraid, I said, to go yourselves into the haunted chambers? No, they answered, we are the custodians of the castle, and have to keep the rooms clean and well aired, lest the furniture be spoiled. My lord always talks of removing it, but it has never yet been removed. But we would not sleep up there for all the world. Then it is the upper floors that are haunted, I said. Yes, they replied, especially the long room. No one could pass a night there. The last that did is in a lunatic asylum now at Warsaw, said the custodian. What happened to him? I don't know, said the man. He was never able to tell. Well, who was he? I asked. He was a lawyer. My lord did business with him, and one day he was speaking of this place and saying that it was a pity he was not at liberty to pull it down and sell the materials, but he cannot, because it is family property and goes with the title, and the lawyer said he wished it was his, and that no ghost would keep him away from it. My lord said it was easy for anyone to say that, who knew nothing about it, and he must suppose that the family had not abandoned such a fine place without good reasons. But the lawyer said it was some trick, and that it was coiners or robbers who had got a footing in the castle, and contrived to frighten people away, that they might keep it to themselves. And my lord said, well, if you could prove that, he would be very much obliged to him, and more than that, he would give him a great sum. I don't know how much. So the lawyer said he would, and my lord wrote to me that he was coming to inspect the property, and I was to let him do anything he liked. Well, he came, and with him his son, a fine young man and a soldier. They asked me all sorts of questions, and went over the castle and examined every part of it. From what they said, I could see they thought the ghost was all nonsense, and that I and my family were in collusion with the robbers or coiners. However, I did not care for that. My lord knew the castle had been haunted before I was even born. I had prepared rooms for them, the same I am preparing for your lordship, and they slept there, keeping the keys of the upper rooms to themselves, so I did not interfere with them. But one morning, very early, we were awakened by someone knocking at our bedroom door, and when we opened it, we saw Mr. Thaddeus, that was the lawyer's son, standing there, half-dressed and as pale as a ghost. He said his father was very ill, and he begged us to go to him. To our surprise, he led us upstairs to the haunted chamber, and there we found the poor gentleman speechless, and we thought that they had gone up there early, and that he had had a stroke, but it was not so. Mr. Thaddeus said that after we were all in bed, they had gone up there to pass the night. I know they thought there was no ghost but us, and that is why they would not let us know their intention. They laid down some sofas, wrapped up in their fur cloaks, and resolved to keep awake, which they did for some time, but at last the young man was overcome by drowsiness. He struggled against it, but could not conquer it, and the last thing he recollects was his father shaking him and saying, Thaddeus, Thaddeus, for God's sake, keep awake. But he could not, and he knew no more till he woke and saw that day was breaking, and found his father sitting in a corner of the room, speechless and looking like a corpse. And there he was when we went up. The young man at first thought he had taken ill or had had a stroke, as we supposed at first. But when we found they had passed the night in the haunted chambers, we had no doubt of what had happened. He had seen some terrible sight, and so lost his senses. He lost his senses, I should say, from terror, when his son fell asleep, said I, and he felt himself alone. He could have been a man of no nerve. At all events, what you tell me raises my curiosity. Will you take me upstairs and show me these rooms? Willingly, said the man, and, fetching a bunch of keys and a light, and calling one of his sons to follow him with another, he led the way up the great staircase to a suite of apartments on the first floor. The rooms were lofty and large, and the man said that the furniture was very handsome but old. Being all covered with canvas cases, I could not judge of it. Which is the long room? I said, upon which he led me into a long, narrow room that might rather have been called a gallery. There were sofas along each side, something like a dais at the upper end, and several large pictures hanging on the walls. I had with me a bulldog of a very fine breed that had been given me in England by a friend. She had followed me upstairs, indeed she followed me everywhere, and I watched her narrowly as she went, smelling about, but there were no indications of her perceiving anything extraordinary. Beyond this gallery there was only a small octagonal room with a door that led out upon another staircase. When I had examined it all thoroughly, I returned to the long room and told the man, as that was the place especially frequented by the ghost, I should feel much obliged if he would allow me to pass the night there. But there is danger to your lordship here, replied the man, and he conjured me not to insist on such a perilous experiment. When he found I was resolved, he gave way, but on condition that I signed a paper, stating that, in spite of his representations, I had determined to sleep in the long room. I confess, the more anxious these people seemed to prevent my sleeping there, the more curious I was. I believed in the ghost the least in the world. I thought that the lawyer had been right in his conjecture, but that he hadn't the nerve enough to investigate what he saw or heard, and that they had succeeded in frightening him out of his senses. I saw what an excellent place these people had got, and how much it was in their interest to maintain the idea that the castle was uninhabitable. Now, I have pretty good nerves. I have been in situations that had tried them severely, and I did not believe that any ghost, if there was such a thing, would shake them. As for real danger, I did not apprehend it. The people knew who I was, and any mischief happening to me would have led to consequences they well understood, so they lighted fires in both the grates of the gallery, and, as they had an abundance of dry wood, they soon blazed up. I was determined not to leave the room after I was once in it, lest, if my suspicions were correct, they might have time to make their arrangements. So I desired my people to bring up my supper, and I ate it there. My courier said he had always heard the castle was haunted, but he dare say there was no ghost but the people below, who had a very comfortable berth of it, and he offered to pass the night with me. But I declined any companion, and preferred trusting to myself and my dog. My valet, on the contrary, strongly advised me against the enterprise, assuring me that he had lived with a family in France whose chateau was haunted, and he had left his place in consequence. By the time I had finished my supper, it was 10 o'clock, and everything was prepared for the night. My bed, though an impromptu one, was very comfortable, made of amply stuffed cushions and thick coverlets placed in front of the fire. I was provided with light and plenty of wood, and I had my regimental cutlass and a case of excellent pistols, which I carefully primed and loaded in presence of the custodian, saying, "You see, I am determined to fire at the ghost, so if he cannot stand a bullet, he had better not pay me a visit." The old man shook his head calmly, but made no answer. Having desired the courier, who said he should not go to bed, to come upstairs immediately if he heard the report of firearms, I dismissed my people and locked the doors, barricading each with a heavy ottoman besides. There was no arras or hangings of any sort behind which a door could be concealed, and I went around the room, the walls of which were panelled with white and gold, knocking every part, but neither the sound nor Dido the dog gave any indications of there being anything unusual. Then I undressed and lay down with my sword and my pistols beside me, and Dido at the foot of my bed, where she always slept. I confess I was in a state of pleasing excitement. My curiosity and my love of adventure were roused, and whether it was a ghost or robber or coiner I was to have a visit from, the interview was likely to be equally interesting. It was 10:30 when I lay down. My expectations were too vivid to admit of much sleep. I could not help thinking that the custodian and his family had some secret way of getting into the room, and I hoped to detect them in the act. So I lay with my eyes and ears open in a position that gave me a view of every part of it, till my travelling clock struck 12, which, being preeminently the ghostly hour, I thought the critical moment was arrived. But no sound, no interruption of any sort to the silence and solitude of the night occurred. When 12:30 and 1 struck, I pretty well made up my mind that I should be disappointed in my expectations, and that the ghost, whoever he was, knew better than to encounter Dido and a brace of well-charged pistols. But just as I arrived at this conclusion, an unaccountable frisson came over me, and I saw Dido, who, tired with her day's journey, had lain still till now, quietly curled up asleep, begin to move, and slowly get to her feet. I thought she was only going to turn, but instead of lying down, she stood still, with her ears erect, and her head turned toward the dais, uttering a low growl. Well, I sat up in bed and looked steadily in the same direction as the dog, but I could see nothing at first, though it appeared that she did. But as I looked, I began to perceive something like a cloud in the chair, while at the same time A chill, which seemed to pervade the very marrow in my bones, crept through me, yet the fire was good, and it was not the chill of fear, for I cocked my pistols with perfect self-possession, and abstained from giving Dido the signal to advance, because I wished eagerly to see the denouement of this adventure. Gradually, this cloud took a form and assumed the shape of a tall white figure that reached from the ceiling to the floor of the dais, which was raised by 2 steps. "At him, Dido, at him!" I said, and away she dashed to the steps, but instantly turned and crept back, completely cowed. As her courage was undoubted, I own this astonished me, and I should have fired, but that I was perfectly satisfied that what I saw was not a substantial human form, for I had seen it grow into its present shape and height from the undefined cloud that first appeared in the chair. I laid my hand on the dog who had crept up by my side, and I felt her shaking in her skin. I was about to rise myself and approach the figure, though I confess I was a good deal awestruck, when it stepped majestically from the dais and seemed to be advancing. "At him," I said, "at him, Dido." And I gave the dog every encouragement to go forward. She made a sorry attempt, but returned when she got halfway and crouched beside me, whining with terror. The figure advanced upon me. When the cold became icy, the dog crouched and trembled, and I honestly confess that I hid my head under the bedclothes and did not venture to look up till morning. I know not what it was. As it passed over me, I felt a sensation of undefinable horror that no words can describe, and I can only say that nothing on earth would tempt me to pass another night in that room, and I am sure if Dido could speak, you would find of her the same opinion. I had desired to be called at 7 o'clock, and when the custodian who accompanied my valet found me, and in my perfect senses, I must say the poor man seemed greatly relieved, and when I descended, the whole family seemed to look upon me as a hero. I thought it only just to admit to them that something had happened in the night that I felt impossible to account for, and that I should not recommend anybody who was not very sure of their nerves to repeat the experiment. When our speaker, the Chevalier, had concluded this extraordinary story, I suggested that the apparition of the castle very much resembled that mentioned by the late Professor Gregory in his letters on mesmerism as having appeared in the Tower of London some years ago, and from the alarm it created, having occasioned the death of a lady, the wife of an officer who was quartered there, and one of his sentries. Everyone who read that very interesting publication was struck by the resemblance.